Welcome everyone to the fifth episode of Psi-Comm series podcast by Chrysalis Bhopal. Today, the topic of discussion is climate change research governing public policy making. Climate change has been described as truly complex and diabolical policy problem. Climate change is a new risk that is big, global, long-term, persistent, and uncertain. Together, these five descriptors make it a threat unique from any other. It thus poses an utterly novel challenge for public policymaking.
To discuss the same, we have with us Professor Eeshan Chaturvedi and Mr. Arpit Chaturvedi. Professor Eeshan Chaturvedi is an environmental and energy lawyer. He completed his LLM in Environmental Law and Policy from Stanford Law School, where he was selected a Rising Environmental Leaders Fellow. Eeshan is a practicing advocate in the Supreme Court of India, founder director of Environmental Public Policy Consultancy EnviPol, co-director of the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability (GPOTS) Fellowship, and a faculty member at the Jindal School for Environment and Sustainability. Mr. Arpit Chaturvedi is an author and strategic management professional with a Master of Public Administration focused in government, politics, and policy studies from Cornell University and an MBA in HR from Symbiosis Center for Management and Human Resource Development. He's an experienced development consultant with a demonstrated history of working in the public policy domain and is the co-founder and CEO of Global Policy Insight, a multinational think tank working on democracy and governance, policy innovation, and international political economy. He is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of EnviPol. We are very honored to have you, sir. I am Thrisha and I am joined by Anirudh Arora.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Trisha and Anirudh.
Okay, sir, to begin with, let us talk about EnviPol. You describe EnviPol as a company that bridges the gap between sustainability and public policy within the field of environment. How do you envision that to happen?
That's a great question, Trisha. First of all, let me thank all of you for putting this together. I really appreciate ventures that are driven towards creating awareness, creating knowledge, creating a conversation. I especially appreciate ventures that are student-run, that shows that the future is bright for us, especially when you're dealing with topics such as sustainability and the topics that we're dealing with today. It also shows that future is bright and future is continuous, which wouldn't happen if we do not have a sustainability approach, which I'm sure we'll touch upon as we go ahead. So thank you for organizing this, guys. I also like to thank Arpit for joining in. It's always a nice feeling to be part of a panel with someone who you can rely upon when it comes to knowledge. You don't have to impart on all the knowledge yourself, and Arpit is around. He takes care of most of it. It's the biggest challenge of our times, one of the biggest challenges of our times. Thrisha, what you've asked, how do you incorporate climate action in policy? EnviPol tries to do that with multiple approaches, multiple verticals of systems thinking, restructuring, training, skill development, compliances, all of those things. But we need to take a step back and go behind the idea of why and what. Now, when I say the greatest challenge, I say it with an absolute understanding, or at least a substantial understanding of what sort of challenges we're facing, especially with international conflicts going all around, a pandemic that is still up and running. But we must realize that every generation has its own biggest challenge. One peak zenith it has to overcome. In the past, it has been, a world war or Spanish flu and plague and a bunch of other things as well. And each of those challenges come across to that generation as being a fight for survival for that generation. Climate change is no different in the sense that it is posing itself as a fight for survival for our generation. But in as much as climate change generally is compared to other challenges that other generations have had to face, we are not just fighting for survival of our generation. We're fighting for survival of every generation that will come after us. And that is why it poses itself as a multidimensional challenge, a challenge that needs us to relook at economics and markets. It needs us to look at sociology, philosophy and ethics. It needs us to relook at our politics and governance, of which Arpit is the substantive expert, so I'll defer to him to speak on that. It needs us to relook at science and the basis of our actions. Are they scientifically viable? Are they long drawn yet impetus ridden? And it also then goes back to a very, very innate human tendency of whether this works for me or not. Because a lot of the times for most of the solutions we're stuck with, yes, it does work for the world. It probably works for the future generations, but does not using a plastic cup or not using a plastic straw, not littering on the street, or keeping the wrapper that you've unwrapped your candy from, putting that in the pocket. Does it work for me? These are very, very small transactional costs. When you add all of them up, it makes an individual impact the climate consciousness of the world. So for all of that to happen, you're basically asking someone to make an apple pie from scratch. And that's the analogy that I usually draw on this, because when you're making an apple, when you ask, so for example, I ask you, Trisha, to make an apple pie from scratch. What you'll do is you'll get some baking powder and you'll get some flour and you'll get some apple and you'll get some sugar and you'll put it all together and bake it and you have an apple pie. But who defines what from scratch is? Does it mean that you have to grow your own apple? Does it mean that you have to have your own flour? Does it mean that to grow that apple, you have to invent your own seed and invent soil and invent atmosphere for the soil to grow in and invent the planet for the soil to have a home and invent the solar system to have that planet and invent the galaxy and the universe? And you can keep on going back in that apple pie analogy. And similarly, to invent this apple pie from scratch of climate change, climate action, climate finance, climate governance, you have to go back to the Big Bang of human civilization and start changing things from that point onwards. So there are no easy solutions, and I wish I had a substantive answer to your short question, but I doubt if I do. I don't know if Arpit could add to this.
Absolutely. I think Eeshan has given quite a comprehensive answer about how we thought EnviPol is an important organization to be around. And see, my position on that, just in addition to what Eeshan has said, is that we typically hear a lot of activists talk about climate policy. We especially see a lot of the younger generation taking action, protesting on the ground, living new and alternative forms of lifestyles to be sustainable. But at the same time, what we don't see is at the mass level, a number of these things being translated into public policy. We have a number of climate-related policies, of course. We have policies coming all over the country, all over the world, actually, on electric vehicles, on solar panels, on water, number of these things. But we don't have any policy, for example, with relation to, the lifestyle choices that we would make, or climate action per se. Sometimes we do have policies. So, for example, a number of states in India, they have policies around, how do you harvest rainwater, etc., where people can take individual action, or, your rooftop horticulture, agriculture, etc. But those policies, even though they are there on paper, they're hardly successful on the ground. Similarly, there are a number of policies such as, The courts have banned the practice of throwing untreated industrial waste into the rivers, etc. But still, a lot of these things are happening on the ground. Okay, so where we come in is to bring, and this is almost like, we think of it in terms of, there's this thing called the triple helix model in systems thinking, which essentially means that you need to have the government, you need to have the industries, and you need to have the research come together to bring about a particular change. And it is only then, when these three things come together, you understand that, okay, if rainwater harvesting is a policy, why is it not being implemented? Do we have the right research on it to draft that policy? Do we have the right capacity to implement it? Or if businesses are still polluting, then what sort of things are required for the businesses? Because even the businesses want to move towards a sustainable, sort of a regime. But they have to be working with the governments, they have to be working with their customers, they have to be working with all of these international compliance regimes in order to be able to easily transition into sustainable businesses. How do they do that? So a lot of these things are there in the idea space, some of them are there in the policy space, but in the implementation space, we don't have that triple helix sort of coming together. So our job essentially is that in many ways, we are ecosystem engineers. We will get all of these things aligned together. We will get, the right research with the right government and the right industry connections, and make them have a conversation to implement some of these extremely hard problems that we see. So essentially, the problem that we are looking at is a problem of cooperation. It's not as if there's not enough research on these fields. There's so much of research happening, and there's obviously a lot of research waiting to take place, but we do have science that you can trust. Similarly, there's no dearth of will on part of the businesses or on part of the government to make this happen. Also, there's no dearth of policy capacity or implementation capacity with the government. So you have everything and still it's not working out. And the reason why it's not working out is some of these factors not coming together. So the aim over here is to bring all of these together and to make them work in sync with each other. So that's the idea.
Yes, sir. I mean, like connecting the dots and making the flow a better, more streamlined is really important in such conditions. Yeah, and like as rightly said by Professor Eeshan, that climate change poses a big risk, and in some sense also it provides us with the opportunity to work together. And this, that what I believe is that this is where the public policy comes in. That we have to, using those policies, we have to reduce those risks that has been imposed by us by the climate change, as well as take advantage of the policies. And till the time these dots have not been connected, it's really tough to do both of these things, that the problem that we are facing right now. So like, yes, sir.
No, I was just saying that certainly what you're saying is right, that it is a risk as well as an opportunity. And I think that, with each risk, there comes, some sort of an opportunity. I think what's missing over here again, as I said, is that even in the youth, you'll see a lot of ways or a lot of will to work towards this, and to get together and to cooperate on some of these agendas. But beyond a few tweets, beyond a few articles, beyond a few protests, and all of these are important. Trust me, these are not just important but critical. But beyond that, I think there's also a lot more action that the youth can bring to the table than what's happening right now.
Yes, sir, definitely. Like that's what majoritively happened. Like recently, the COP26 session took place, and the social media was boomed with the whole trending news. And then after after at max few weeks, everything was just vanished. People were posting stuff, and then they all disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah. Given the current climate crisis, how crucial do you think that climate science research is in policy making?
Well, I'll let Eeshan answer that, but I think that it is absolutely crucial because, see, we are also in terms of policy making, we are in a very new age. In India, if you look at things, rewind 30 years, and you really did not have a culture of making evidence-based policies. I mean, it was usually an afterthought, but not an organizing principle. Uh, Similarly, globally, it wasn't until late 60s, 70s where evidence-based policy making became a thing per se. And when we are talking about evidence-based policy making, the only reliable way of collecting evidence that we know as human beings is science, and it's only through science, whether through pure or applied sciences or through social sciences, it's only through that we can be sure of the evidence that we have. Because unlike many other philosophical ways of knowing the truth, in India, traditional culture talks about many different ways. Even in research methodologies, you're taught about finding the truth in many different ways, including inference, etc., etc. When you talk about climate change policies, what matters is not inference. What matters is not comparison, but what matters is evidence, and that evidence comes from pure hard science, and becomes really important. But I'll let Eeshan add something to this.
Yeah, I think that really sort of summarizes what is needed and why science plays such a major role. I'll just give you a couple of examples that I use in my lectures or otherwise to explain how science works in the climate space. So first of all, let us understand that I think it was 1809 AD, that a Swedish physicist in the Journal of Physical Sciences, I think it was. I'll have to fact check these, but this is what I remember. He talked about the impact of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's over a couple of centuries since we've known this. It obviously came into prominence in the last 40 years or so. But the two anecdotes that I want to tell you about, one is from this place called Kumagaya in Japan. Okay, now Kumagaya in Japan is this lovely little town northwest, I think, of Tokyo. If you Google it, you'll find beautiful cherry blossoms and beautiful photos, and you'd want to go there. Now, something happened in Kumagaya in July 2018. Okay, so the first week of July, you had floods and torrential rains and mudslides, and terrible things happened. And then around the 9th of July, there was a bit of a heat wave. Japan started heating up. 23rd of July, Monday, the heat wave in Japan touched around 42 degrees, the highest temperature ever recorded in Japan. Okay, 73,000 people, that's the conservative estimate, were hospitalized. Over 1,000 people died. And now, on the 24th of July, in Japan, the Japan Meteorological Department, whatever the name is, calls it a natural disaster. Okay. Now, this is very important because heat wave is a natural disaster, right? Let's take another anecdote. Now, exactly 365 days later, there's July 2019 in Europe, in Paris, if you want to take specific examples. There was a warning issued that people should stop traveling out in the open. Okay, in July 2019. The chief architect of Notre Dame warned that the extreme heat could lead to cathedral's roof falling, collapsing, if the joints and masonries holding up the roof dried out. around 1,500 people died from what I remember. And all of this happened all across Europe. So the Met Meteorological Department conducted a study in 2020 that found that the UK was now 30 times more likely to experience heat waves compared to 3 centuries back. Now, a lot of people argue that, listen, heat waves have existed since time immemorial, and why do you create a big issue every time there's a heat wave? Well, the fact of the matter is that exactly to what you mentioned, Anirudh, in your basic introduction, when you said that it's a global issue. Now, climate change is a global issue. It's a global issue and a local issue. So locally, Kumakia experienced a terrible heat wave, loss of lives in 2018. The UK, EU experienced a terrible heat wave in 2019. So these are perfectly explainable, localized natural disasters, right? Attribution science, which is a paradigm of science that looks at how much can you attribute climate change for whatever is happening, gives us the ratios in which that heat waves would have happened 200 years back. So it isn't like heat waves did not happen 200 years back. They're just 10 times, 15 times, 20 times, 100 times more likely to happen now. So that's where science is almost, sitting us down, holding us by the shoulders, shaking us up and saying that, listen, this is happening all around you, do something about it. And what do? We call it, as lawyers say, force majeure, act of God, natural disaster, and we wipe our hands off it and we walk away. But the fact of the matter is that, is it any longer a natural disaster? Is it happening naturally? Is it like an earthquake that tectonic plates move and an earthquake happens? No, it's now attributable. The floods and famines and droughts and heat waves and mudslides and landslides and glacial recessions, our sea level rise, all are attributable to human action towards putting more carbon in the atmosphere and human inaction in doing something about it. So that's where the science comes in. And there are two concepts to this. There's a concept of capacity and there's a concept of culpability. Humans are culpable to lead us where we are today. And that is something that all of us should shed our hubris about and face the mirror and say that, all right, we have generationally contributed to this. The second is capacity. And that's where EnviPol and what Arpit was talking about comes in. Do we have the capacity to do something about it? You can be someone of a Malthusian view and say that, listen, population grows exponentially, food grows in a linear way. We will run out of food eventually. So there's no point doing anything about this. Let's just enjoy and spend all the carbon that we have. Or you can be a population optimist and you can say that, no, we can do something about it. And the fact of the matter is that there is capacity. There's capacity in tech, there is capacity in human resource and economics and carbon markets and financial markets generally. And most importantly, there's capacity in skill. Now, what we need to do is meet that capacity with what Arpit was saying, with implementation on ground. I also want to take a moment to appreciate that human beings have historically not done anything that does not benefit them in the short term. Very rarely done things that benefit them in the short term, which do not benefit them in the short term. So there's a significant element of a branch of science, by the way, of behavioral psychology, economics, that comes into play, that will help us make decisions that appear short term but will benefit us in the long term. An example could be an ecocentric end through an anthropocentric means, right? So how important is science? Science is now telling us that, listen, do something about it. This has been happening for the past 250, 300 years now. Science is also telling us that this is how you could do it, change your behaviors this way and, implement more startling means to realize your carbon footprint, and every time you fly, your ticket should read your carbon footprint for taking that flight. But it's the consciousness, awareness, education, implementation that requires to meet that warning sign that has been put up by the science, and and I must commend the wonderful work that's happening on the climate science front to make us aware of these things.
Yes, sir. The incidents that you highlight, it is clear that it is a climate emergency now. That like 20 years ago, what we said that in 20 years, if we don't make a change now, in 20 years, this all will happen. We are seeing it now. We are seeing floods, droughts at the same time happening in places on a very extreme scale and all of it. And as you said, so science is telling us, it is telling us that like this is an urgent issue and we need to listen. So are we listening? What do you think is the current situation regarding such policy making? And how is it impacting the human race?
Okay, just one thing before we get into that. See, I think as human beings, we've put in a lot of deadlines, and we have been gloriously unable to meet any of those. And I think there are two major issues in the way that we frame the whole climate change and the broader sustainability debate. One is that if we look at end dates, if we look at deadlines, and this is one thing that I cover in a game theory lecture that I deliver at the GPODS Fellowship, which, by the way, I think you guys should check out. The thing is that whenever you're playing a game, this particular climate change game is also a game of cooperation, wherein, just like you don't litter in a place which is clean and you litter in a place which is already dirty. So in the second scenario, what you typically think is that, why should I pay the cost of not littering when, or just carrying that wrapper in my pocket and walking for 2 kilometers to find the next dustbin, when me not taking that action me not littering is still going to keep the place dirty because others are littering. So I typically think that, I will stop when the others stop doing it. Okay. And that's what happens in climate change as well, that we typically think that I will not do it when the others stop doing it as well. So, I will, have a more sustainable lifestyle when everybody else does it. It's not as if I can stop using my car these days. It's not as if I can stop traveling. If I have to, travel or go, let's say, to the US, then I cannot, let's say, board a ship and do that. I just don't have that sort of time. So when everybody starts, making those choices, I'm going to start making those choices. So we fail to cooperate, and, we are stuck in that sort of a equilibrium where everybody is not cooperating because everybody is not cooperating with climate change. Now, when you have an end date, when you have a deadline to this, what typically happens, and there's a huge game theoretical explanation to it, which I am not going to get into right now, that wherever you frame things in a manner which has deadlines, you would not see cooperation, because you would get people to essentially think that, okay, it's anyway going to end in, let's say, 2050. And I know that, if it is going to end in 2050, nobody is going to take much action until then. So why not just keep living the way that I'm living, or do the minimal so that I don't look like a bad person? And eventually, even if I correct myself, it's not as if we are all going to survive in 2050 or beyond that. So let me just, keep living the way that I'm living, okay, or just take the path of least resistance. Now, on the other hand, when you, and again, I'm saying that I'm not going into the, precise game theoretical explanation, because that's a longer one. But when you think about infinite games, and that's just a property of cooperation, that when you think about infinite games, so you frame the situation in a way that we are not going to be an entity which would cease to exist. It's not a deadline that we are looking at, but we are an entity which is going to be there in this nature forever. And if we are to live here forever, then it's better that we live under conditions which would suit us, or under conditions which make at least living bearable. Okay. The second issue that I have, so that's the issue with the deadlines. And I think that as long as we have deadlines, we are going to be gloriously missing those deadlines every time. We have the Millennium Development Goals now. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll come up with a new term every time. Okay. So we're not good at cooperative racing. We are good at competitive racing as human species. Okay. Now, the second thing is about this whole idea behind sustainability, because I typically think that the issue that we have is that we somehow have framed sustainability as degrowth. That, okay, we'll have to do something lesser than, we'll have to live in a manner which is lesser than what the previous generations have lived with. Okay, so we would consume less, we'd have to be a lot more careful. Life would be lesser than it has been earlier. And we need to get away from this mindset, because the way that sustainability works, again, a game theoretical explanation to that would be that if you frame it in a manner that, if you live sustainability, you'd have a life which is better than any time before. It's going to be so good that you haven't had, that sort of a level of consumption or level of happiness, utility, whatever, unprecedented. You'd have never seen that before. Only then. So in game theoretical terms, people would cooperate when cooperation becomes really, really lucrative. So we need to frame it, in a more positive manner as well.
Yes, so like I would like to add it to it is that, like, when we frame these deadlines, the deadlines are so framed that the normal people believe that it's the work of the bigger corporations and the big people to work on it, like reducing the whole of the carbon. So people believe that that's not my work, that I go to office, how much carbon would I be contributing? It's the work of a bigger company. But that is not the exact case. They should be made aware that not buying plastic water bottles, or switching your toothbrush to a wooden one, these small acts in a bigger population could lead to a drastic change that these bigger corporations could not have been able to made in that particular deadline amount.
Absolutely.
I would just like to add, I hope I don't sound too pessimistic here, but there was a 2017 report, I think it was a CDP report, that just 100 companies have contributed to 71% of global emissions since 1988. So when we look at such statistics, when we look at corporations going unchecked and absolutely not caring about sustainability or the damage they are causing, it feels like, is it really creating an impact of me? Am I really creating an impact by using a wooden toothbrush instead of a plastic one? So the situation is so bad that individual initiatives won't matter in the long run or and the broader picture. So what would you say about that? Like, why is it important that I still continue to take initiatives on an individual level? Like last year we saw the ocean on fire. Like, we did not think we would ever see that. And when you see something of that scale, you really sit and think, is it really mattering that I have been trying my best to use environment friendly products and such, but is it really mattering? So what would you say about that? How can we keep our climate consciousness?
So, Thrisha, that's an excellent point, first of all, and something that all of us have dealt with at some point in our life, about climate pessimism, climate optimism. I am an absolute climate optimist. At the Global Policy Diplomacy Sustainability Fellowship, with the GPOTS Fellowship, which you guys mentioned, Arpit mentioned, we have a rule in my lectures that we look at climate change optimistically, climate action optimistically, and how we can change it. Now, about your larger question about the private sector and how they can make a difference and how little we could do. There in law, there are two concepts. There's a concept of a natural person. There's a concept of a legal person. A natural person is you, me, person who's born. A legal person is, say, a corporation which could be sued, which can sue, but you have to remove the corporate veil to see who is really taking the decisions. At some point of time, we need to stop blaming natural persons, which are our creation, for hampering the environment, right? Now, every system, every organization has a role and has a motive, right? You can tomorrow blame the government that, why are they making this new policy? They are there to make policies. That's what governments do, right? Why are they governing us? They are literally called government. They will govern. That's what they do. Now, private sector, what is it there for? It is there to make profit for itself, right? If Anirudh and Thrisha, both of you tomorrow get together and you want to start a company, and if I tell you that, listen, I love the idea of a company, the only catch I have for your company is don't make profit because it will harm environment. Would you go ahead with the company? No, you would not, because the point of that company is to make profit. The missing piece in this whole argument against the private sector is that private sector is not driven by profit motive of itself. So it's not making money of itself. It's making money of you and me. So the end game in this whole puzzle is the consumer, is the customer of that private sector, which is offering a particular good, a commodity, or service. So how do you change consumer behavior for the private sector to change its behavior in such a way that it becomes more sustainable? So you can blame a fast fashion company, and at the same time, you can order 50 pairs of jeans in 5 years. That is not how it could work. You cannot blame a car company that's known to be a guzzler of fuel and then drive it and have it as your dream car. So once you make enough money, I'll be driving that car so the issue is not, at least this is what this is how I see it. Issue is not with profit making. Issue is not with the private sector. Issue is how we can convince the private sector, and that's the gap we need to bridge. That, listen, as a consumer, I'm only going to buy sustainable products, right? I'm only going to engage with services that are carbon footprint free. And that's the onus of the society. Because my fear is that you will absolutely, let's use the word degrowth. You'll start on a path towards degrowth if you start demonizing all the private sector organizations that, you haven't done anything and now you're expecting me not to litter. Again, like, that person is literally incorporated to make profits. It is making profit. You are incorporated to live a sustainable lifestyle and you have an issue with not littering. So change our behaviors, that will be reflected in market trends, which will change the market. Again, there's a reason why it is called the invisible hand. It is you and I that guide the hand. It is the market that guides the hand. So demonizing the private sector for what it does is not right without understanding that there is a gap that needs to be bridged either through circular economy or through sustainable choices or sustainable pricing of, a very good point here is, if we buy a pair of jeans, right, it costs us 1,500 bucks, 2,000. I'm talking in INR for those of us who are listening in from other countries. But if we are buying, $30, $40, $100, $500 jeans, pair of jeans, do we realize that each pair of jeans takes anywhere between 21,000 to 63,000 liters of water to make? And do we realize that a lot of the times these pair of jeans are manufactured in places which are facing water scarcity? And have we paid for the value of the jeans or the cost of the jeans? Is the value of the jeans the cost of the water that went into making it, or just the MRP that you're selling it for? And those are the considerations that you and I will have to have. So the answer to this, the short answer to this very, very long explanation is that customers and consumers and people like you and me need to know the value of a certain thing and then be ready to pay the value of that certain thing. Because, again, we also need to realize that a large part of the population, global population, anywhere to the tune of 40-50% of the global population cannot afford what products are being sold as sustainable products. You talk of a wooden toothbrush. How many people can afford a wooden toothbrush? What is a plastic toothbrush? I mean, a lot of people don't even use a toothbrush. They use that the neem branch instead. So how are we?
Most of the people are using toothbrushes that cost what, 10 rupees, nothing more than that, and the wooden ones would be upwards of 250, I believe.
Yeah. So that's the point. So it's about consumer choices. It's also about creating awareness about those consumer choices. And we should be very careful about demonizing any sector, whether that's private sector, public sector. Every sector has its negatives, civil society included.
Because then you'll just pass the buck, na? We'll demonize the private sector, they demonize the government demonizes the voters. It's a loop. But also just to add one thing to what you had earlier mentioned, Trisha or Anirudh, I think one of you said that these many companies are creating 80% of the pollution. What is that statistic? Would you want to repeat that as well? This once?
Yeah, 10 companies, yes. 70%, right?
Yes, sir. 100 companies, 71% global emissions.
Yeah.
100 companies, 71% global emissions. So if you look at that stat, and this is actually, one of the ministers that was talking in the fellowship who comes in as a mentor was giving a very similar stat that 100 companies leading to 70% of the emissions. But also, if you look at India, you also see that on the other side of companies which are trying to do good, you have only about 1,600 companies, to be precise, 1,599 companies, covering about 94% of the CSR funds in India. So contributing over 94% of the CSR funds in India. So you have a few companies who are doing disproportionate bad, and you have another few companies who are doing disproportionate good. So obviously, from a linear perspective, you would want some of these good companies to do more good, some of these bad companies to do lesser of bad. But the juice of the game is in the middle of the spectrum.
Right.
You need to get all of the other companies in the middle to do a little more. Not a lot, but just a little more.
No. One other thing that I'll be interested in knowing, Arpit, about this statistic is if 100 companies have caused 71% of climate harm, in their business as usual functioning, what percentage of population has used, consumed, or benefited from their products or services?
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, it's not, as I said, a company is not functioning in a watertight compartment where it's just
they're selling to somebody.
Exactly. Right? And if you're buying, then how can you say that no, it was producing, so I bought that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bought. Well, there's a demand. That's why there's a supply.
Absolutely. So, I mean, a lot of these that's why they're called wicked problems. So they have a chicken and egg sort of a story. And the art of policy making is really how do you, disentangle the chicken and the egg and at least have some spot where you can have some intervention.
So that's a very interesting perspective. I often see this study actually quoted on Twitter every time any corporation says anything. So that is why I thought
that's
Trisha, I must. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I am absolutely in agreement with all of this. I am in agreement that companies should cut down their carbon footprint. Arpit is as well. It's just that we cannot game the system by just going after one part of the system. You need to understand how to change system dynamics by understanding supply and demand, not just the supply bit of it.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So, what is the scenario about all this in India? Like, what efforts are being taken and must be taken to spread further awareness about the urgency of this matter?
So let me talk about what's happening in India. First of all, again, I already confessed that I am a climate optimist. I think we'll come out of this, and I think that we have the capacity and the guilt for having led us where we have been positioned at for the past 100 years. Youth engagement is increasing, their environmental footprint. Whether they act or not is, the free will question. But at least they're conscious about it. And as consciousness grows, it will sort of force the hand of each consumer, customer, denizen of this country. The other thing is, and something that Arpit and I are very proud of, is organizations and opportunities such as the Global Policy, Diplomacy, Sustainability, the GPOTS Fellowship coming up, which is looking at sustainability not being a siloed issue. So if you want to achieve sustainability, it is no longer that, I'll become a climate finance professional and I'll solve it. No, you need to understand a bit of policy. You need to understand a bit of international relations. You need to understand a bit of climate change and governance and communications and behavior and circular economy and economy generally and social ethics. All of those things need to come together. And that's why the GPOTS Fellowship has had the kind of success it has had, because it is serving all of these things within one paradigm of GPOTS, right? And the fact that there are fellows coming through and fellows who are interested in understanding these aspects of sustainability, of public policy, of international relations is a very good indicator of how the youth is invested, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, and this is fairly controversial, so I'll put this with the rider, that this is only a reflection. This is not a moral judgment on what is happening. But I see over the last 10, 15 years, as I'm sure all of our listeners and all of you have heard as well, companies are now spending more and more in advertising, marketing, PR for appearing to be green. What is traditionally called as greenwashing. Now, greenwashing is a very bad thing because you're not actually green, you're not actually sustainable, but you want to be perceived as being green so that people will buy you more because you'll have a good PR. It's a terrible thing, but being an optimist, I'll give you another dimension to this greenwashing bit. Greenwashing is an excellent indicator of how the tides are changing. If a company that has been, as I said, incorporated to make profits is willing to shell out a share from its profits to invest in appearing to be sustainable, that means that it is invested in either at this stage appearing to be green or sustainable, but that interest will then eventually, once we have the governance mechanism, public policy and law, transcend into actually being sustainable, because that's an indicator that consumers are putting you on a pedestal. And if you do not function as a sustainable unit organization, then you will have problems with the market. And that is also a good indicator, and that's happening globally. But I think that that's happening in India as well, and which is a bad thing, which is a good indicator, right? And thirdly, I do think that in terms of our governance, we saw, I think last month or a couple of months back, we saw that the Honorable Supreme Court of India asked the government to respond to it on what's happening with the Indian Environmental Services. That means that government, judiciary, all of our pillars of democracy are also channelizing new innovative thought towards governing environment. And these are all good signs. Whether we require more governance, less governance, that's a topic altogether that needs to be discussed separately. But these are all good indications, is what I say. capacity building through GPods as a fellowship, which is so well respected now because of its intersections of policy, diplomacy, and sustainability. And its certificate holds so much value because of that. And capacity building at the high school level, at the graduation level, all of these things are happening, which I think are excellent indicators. India also, you need to be conscious that it is said that almost 30% of all climate impacts will be suffered by the Indian subcontinent. So India has a major stake in what happens in the climate change debate. And that's why we need to be even more forthcoming and proactive in doing something about this issue.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just about to comment on one of the things that Eeshan said, that, see, the difference is that we are in one way or the other moving towards sustainability, and all the indications in the government, they show that we have to be, moving towards that. And first it'll be a lot of rhetoric, first it'll be a lot of talk, but eventually once the talk has happened, then you have to perform on some of the parameters that you've talked about. And some of those solutions, as Eeshan said, the Indian Environmental Services, I remember that, there was this panel discussion happening and around COVID, and I was part of that. And one of the members in the panel had proposed that let's have an Indian health services on the basis of an IAS. And I said that I absolutely don't agree with that idea, because the IAS has a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies all over the world, especially if they become permanent bureaucracies, such as what we have in India, they become slow, they become onerous, they become extremely inefficient. And another thing that they do is that they create a disconnect or sort of a disempowerment amongst the civil society to do something about that issue. Because if, let's say the Indian Health Services is working on health, then why should we bother about doing anything about it? Or if the Indian Administrative Services is working on administration, why should we bother? So a lot of times, where the ideas are right or wrong, those are the places where folks like us who are researching on issues around governance come in. So, but at the same time, yes, a lot of action is going to take place in the sustainability field. And at GPods, we absolutely believe in the fact that all jobs in the future, whether you're in finance, whether you're in security, whether you're in computer programming, all jobs are sustainability jobs at the end of the day. Because eventually what you're trying to do, eventually the whole of the humankind has been, not from right now, but from many millennia, we've been trying to understand how do we survive given the environment, okay, and how do we live sustainably. So all jobs are going to be about that in the future as well.
I'm like, I, as an outside observer, thinks that there is a lot of confusion in the national conversation on climate change. Like, a clear and expressive narrative can help cut through the clutter. Like, as you rightly mentioned, that people, the big corporations as well as the government have started to think about it, and talks are taking place. But these talks are only taking place, and the action is getting delayed. Like, that's what I think that is happening. Like, obviously talks are happening, that's a really good thing, but only talks are happening is also not a good thing.
So I think talks to action are on a 100-to-1 ratio right now. And I think with time, and that's what happens for any policy, that, for most of the beginning phase of a policy, it's 99% talk, 1% action. And then you move to another phase where it's probably 80% talk, 20% action. But after you've reached a tipping point, you're eventually going to see a space where, very quickly after 80%, you'll see 50% talk and action, then 20% talk and most of the action. But it's a long curve that you need to go in.
And that's exactly one of the challenges with climate change, that, we have everything but time. So on a scale of time, we need more action. And I agree with Arpit that is the usual trajectory. But as Anirudh says, that there has to be more action. We also have to be mindful of the fact that, we are talking about governance of a country that is about 1.3 billion people, full and diversity and distinctions and so many other challenges of demographics and meteorology, and I wish it were easier for us to implement policies, but we are a very proud nation of diverse folks and diverse topographies and demographies, and we need to make sure that we look at it as a strength and make sure that we can find effective mechanisms to cater to the 1.4, 1.3 billion people in a way that it is effective and on a scale of time quick as well.
And I think that when the research of these climate scientists, when coupled with the decision making, it could make the ratio of talk to action a little better, and better as well as little faster to happen.
Right.
That's the hope, absolutely.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah, sir. So diving a little into policy making, at what stage of policy making does climate-oriented policies face the most opposition, which creates this, 90% talk and only 10% action thing?
So you're saying at what stage does it face the most opposition? Well, I think it depends on how you're framing the policy. So there are two ways of looking at it. Number one is that if there are one sorts of policies where you're taking from one and giving to another. Okay, these are called redistributive policies. Okay. And these policies are typically the ones where you find one very staunch opponent from whom you're taking, and one party at least who's a very staunch supporter to whom you're giving. Okay, that's one form of policy, and here opposition and support sort of balance out. Okay. Then you have certain policies where you're taking from many and giving it to a few. Okay, and those could be for good and bad purposes, both. For a good purpose, you could take, let's say a Swachh Bharat cess from everybody. So you're taking from many and you're giving it to a few. Only the people who might just, benefit from, more contracts and drainages, more contracts and rebuilding, some of the urban ecosystems, etc. Okay, so in such cases, you're taking from many and giving it to a few. And in these policies, you'll find some supporters and no opposition most of the time. If procedurally you're able to show some evidence of progress. And then there are a few policies where you're taking from a few and giving it out to many. And those policies would typically find a lot of opposition that, and typically climate change, if you're talking about air pollution and you're talking about, some of these things, they fall into that category where you're taking from a few, and those few are the corporations who are, leading to the pollution, who are causing that pollution, and giving to many, which means that this policy benefits the public at large. All right. So you have a few very staunch opponents of this particular policy, but everybody is benefiting a little bit. There's no concentrated benefit on anybody. So these policies obviously find a lot more resistance. And for these policies, you need policy entrepreneurs. You need people who can champion and who can create stakeholders which become a counterweight to the opponents. Any policy which is being opposed by, let's say, certain companies or certain interest groups, which benefits the environment, should also have a counter group of supporting that policy extremely staunchly, okay, and converting that into various benefits, whether electorally or otherwise. So I think if you design or if you frame a policy in a manner where you have fewer opponents and greater number of concentrated support groups, I think those are the policies that typically see a passage.
I must also add, in addition to what Arpit said, that one of the studies that I was going through recently had a conservative estimate of $750 billion per annum given away to the fossil fuel industry in subsidies. Right now, we need to understand subsidies. Subsidies is where the government is giving a discount, simplistically, and government is not making the money from itself mostly, it is taxing the citizens, and hence you are funding the subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry. So you are breathing the air that is polluted by the fossil fuel industry, spending more in your healthcare, and also making sure that the fossil fuel industries keep on functioning the way it does. The reason why I'm mentioning this in the context of what Trisha asked and Arpit said is because there are very, very large interests where the subsidies themselves, I'm not talking about the overall revenue or the turnover or the profits that these companies make. I'm saying the subsidies itself are to the tune of $785 billion. So imagine how much would a company be willing to lobby, willing to put in this conversation at the ideation stage, at the execution stage, at the policy framing stage, to not have a policy that makes them obsolete.
Yes, sir. And what do you think needs to be done with immediate effect, and what changes do you think that needs to be secured in the long run in order to tackle the climate change?
So, okay, I know that Eeshan has to leave quickly, so we can probably comment on this before we close the discussion. But in the long run, if you ask me, a lot of it is about how you frame policies, policy narratives. And we've talked a little bit about that. The other important thing that we've talked about is that, how do you align different stakeholders? So you need to have some stakeholders whose sole job is to align all of the stakeholders. And those become extremely, extremely important. And in the longer run, I think that, education of people about public policy, about sustainable development, I think those become really, really relevant, because if you are going in with a mental model of being more sustainable as an individual, you're likely to make those policies at the larger scale, and you're likely to think of more efficient designs, keeping that larger scale in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I just echo what Arpit said. It has to be a holistic approach. It has to be, I often draw an analogy of how mathematics is involved in everything from, computers to everything tech and everything that we use in our everyday life. And similarly, you need to think of sustainability as not a distinct discipline that is divorced from other disciplines. So sustainability has to be seen as the mother of all social sciences at some point as well, which has impact on every other thing that you do, every other policy and law and tech and financial governance model that you venture into.
Yes, sir. So our target audience comprises of students mainly. So what would be your message that you would send to budding scientists with regard to the discussion we have had today? I would like both of you to provide some parting words.
Sure. So first of all, guys, the fact that you've stayed on this podcast for so long means that you're driven towards climate change and sustainability. So that's a step in the right direction. The second thing is, do not preclude yourself of policy making or law making, or if you're from either of these systems, then from climate science, because ultimately you need to understand the problem, and to understand the problem you need to really delve into all the aspects of the problem. So take up courses, readings, books, again fellowships such as the GPOS fellowship that give you that understanding about sustainability from all of its dimensions, about public policy from all of its dimensions. The second thing is, much like a democracy, every vote is important. Similarly, in sustainability, every voice, every action, every little decision to not litter or reducing my waste reducing your waste is as important. One of my professors, when I asked him which is the cleanest form of energy, had told me that the cleanest form of energy is the one that you do not use. So reducing our usage is as much of an important lesson to take as it is to get others to reduce. But again, it starts at you, and if everyone reduces their usage, we will have a lower peak of our electricity consumption, for example, which means that we do not have to run those thermal power plants that we are fighting against for a decade now. So again, there are it's about you. This is your life at stake, and your children's and grandchildren's and parents and grandparents' lives at stake. And whether or not you want to believe it or face it, but the future of humanity rests on you.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely, I'd echo what Eeshan said, and I think that a message to future scientists or anybody who's working in the field of sustainable development is that you need to understand that the solutions don't exclusively lie in one particular field. You could be working as a scientist, you could be working as a policymaker, you could be working as a politician, you could be working as a grassroots activist, and even a poet or an artist, and still have a great impact on sustainability. And in fact, you would need all of these. You could have the best of the science, and we are seeing it right now. Just because we may not have the best of the narrators of those stories, we are not seeing as much policy action on this. Okay, or no, you may be the best of the policy makers, but if you don't find the right politicians to align people around your policy is never going to see the light of day. So the idea over here is that you need to build a talent pool which is committed towards the idea and is also diversified enough to cooperate around the various facets which are needed for meaningful policy action to take place. And we would also have to be permissive and understand of the fact that a lot of times our best case scenario, a scientist might think that this is exactly what things should look like, may not be possible. And that's where you would need to sit down with the other stakeholders and see what works out the best for everybody. And that's a complex thing to do, but that's the only way.
Yes, sir. We totally agree with you that it is only through a two-way communication and relationship building that effective partnerships can be formed, and that would help us in the short run as well as the long run.
Absolutely.
With that, I think we would wrap up our discussions. Thank you so much to both of you for taking time to join us. I'm sure that our listeners will leave with much food for thought.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so
guys.
much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.